Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Football Outsiders Fantasy Show. I'm your host, Scott Spratt, a writer for Football Outsiders. It's 1 p.m. and it's during the season. That means that we are live on twitch.tv/FB Outsiders. We're going to be there 5 days a week. I'll be there on Tuesdays and Fridays doing fantasy content. Mike Tanier, and Aaron Schatz and others are going to be doing Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And then every Tuesday this year, I'm also going to have our buddy Derrik Klassen, one of our top guests from our waiver wire discussions last year, coming in every Tuesday. Derrik, so glad to have you. How's it going, man?
I'm glad to be back. I'm glad that this is a thing we get to do every week now. I mean, we don't have the film, so some of my insights might be a little off this week, but hopefully that'll be back soon, and I'm just ready to get going.
But at least you understand how to watch film, because I'm over here just crunching numbers and stuff. So, I mean, feel free to just call me a nerd throughout every episode as desired.
I mean, we need the yin and yang. Sometimes, my intuition is going to lead me astray. It's done it before and it'll do it again.
Absolutely. All right. So the basic nature of the game we're going to play every Tuesday at 1 is, am I too high or too low? So I have our waiver wire article for fantasy up on Football Outsiders. Not sure if it's up quite yet, but it'll be up shortly if it isn't. And in it, I recommend FAB bids for players, basically saying how much should you spend to try to acquire this player to help your fantasy roster for the rest of the year. And Derrik, you're going to be a good sort of test checker to make sure that I'm not out of too high, too low on players, that sort of thing. Run through a series of those guys and try to decide on that. And I think we need to start with the biggest injury-related news maybe of the week, which was that Raheem Mostert got knocked out with, I believe, a chipped bone in his knee. It wasn't like an ACL or anything, but still expected to knock him out for the next 8 weeks or so, which I think renders 6th-round rookie Eli Mitchell the number one FAB pickup of the week. I have him at 62% of your FAB spending. Derrik, am I too high or too low?
I mean, I think you throw everything you have at him, honestly, because
that's fair. Yeah.
For a couple of reasons. One, because he just looked fantastic. Mm-hmm. He just looked really good. He's incredibly fast. If he gets into space, he's just fantastic. But you also have to remember, like, these Kyle Shanahan offenses, he's done a little bit more to mix up his run concepts lately, but he wants to be an outside zone team and he wants those runs to hit to the perimeter. Mitchell is obviously really good at that. And I think that is especially true with Mostert now being, sidelined for a couple of months now. So, like, he's really the only guy that they have that can really hit the perimeter like that. Yeah. Trey Sermon, I think, was a healthy scratch, and Sermon can do some stuff like in the middle, kind of between the tackles. He's a really tough runner, but I don't think he provides any of what Mitchell does. I think they're just completely different players. So I have a feeling Kyle Shanahan is going to continue using Mitchell pretty much as he can get.
I mean, traditionally, Shanahan has definitely had a type, and it's these super, super fast backs. Mitchell is definitely that. He ran a 4.32 40 time. I think maybe at a pro day, they weren't doing the normal combine stuff last year, but that is the famous Raheem Mostert time that I think made him the fastest running back in the NFL, at least by that one measure. Meanwhile, Trey Sermon is bigger, but ran a 4.58. So different type of player, as you mentioned. I think I got thrown off the scent. I mean, it seems like everybody did because Sermon was drafted 2 rounds earlier, but I guess the main question here is, like, is it possible that Mitchell was in there because he's a kick returner, like special teams contributor, where if you don't have Mostert healthy, that maybe Sermon's going to be activated from now on?
I mean, I think it's that. I think it's also just entirely possible that maybe Sermon just didn't look the way that, Kyle Shanahan wanted him to in camp. And I think Kyle Shanahan is a guy who's not really going to care what he spent on you. He's going to just play the best player. I think especially at running back when he wants, very specific things. So I really don't think that, draft capital or whatever matters. I think it's just Mitchell was the better player, and I think they're going to continue to play him so long as he's better than Trey Sermon.
Yeah, really, Sermon is the only possible, wrinkle in this whole situation in my mind, because despite the better plans, Mostert only made it through 4 snaps. So that kind of left you the whole game to evaluate how much work is he going to get versus how much JaMycal Hasty, the other active running back, was going to get. And it was just all Mitchell. He played 64% of offensive snaps. Hasty played just 29%. Mitchell got 19 carries, ran for 104 yards. I mean, you feel like with the Shanahan scheme that pretty much any back getting the majority of the work is going to be really successful. But, maybe you're right. I think I may have undersold it. Mitchell seems like a player that maybe you really should spend your entire FAB to grab.
And the last thing I'll say is just that, we knew the Kyle Shanahan offense was going to be able to run the ball well, but and that Lions team is embarrassing. But the one good thing that Lions team has is a defensive line. Those guys can play, and the fact that they were able to run the way that they did on that defensive line, I think is not only encouraging for Mitchell, but really just the offense as a whole.
Yeah, on Twitch, Mr. Jackpots asks, is 70% fab too crazy for Mitchell? I think we clearly are both thinking no. Like, play to the league specifications a little bit, how much in demand running backs are. But it seems like you and I both think that you may end up with an RB2 for the next 8 weeks, or who knows? I mean, Mostert has been an injury-prone player in the past. It could end up being like a full season's worth of value there. All right, next up, this is actually the player that through halftime of the Monday night game, I was penciling in as our top guy to talk about, Tyson Williams of the Ravens. But then in the second half, fourth quarter and overtime particularly, he kind of disappeared, and I lowered him and lowered him until I ended up at 36%. It still seemed like he was a very efficient player with 9 carries and 69 yards. The Ravens had a really good run blocking line last year, top 8 in adjusted line yards, but Latavius Murray was kind of getting in the mix here. Now I'm not really sure what to think of this backfield. What do you think, Derek?
What I would think had happened in that game with the way they kind of shifted where their running back carries were going is I think they realized that running up the middle against the Raiders was kind of the way they needed to play that. I think, Max Crosby, particularly on the edge, was really good. And I think those linebackers were doing a little bit better job getting to the edge than maybe we had imagined. And just the difference between Murray and Williams is that I think Williams is not as clean a runner, getting up the middle, kind of seeing those sort of things. But if you get him out into space, he's incredibly explosive. He's a really good athlete. Yeah. Whereas Murray is kind of more like you kind of just want to jam him ahead and just hope that he's going to break a couple of tackles and push the pile forward. And you kind of saw that on that, I think that goal line, or not goal line, but they were inside the 10 that Murray got. So I think they still want to have those explosive plays with Williams. So I think getting him at what did you say, 36% or so? Yeah. I think that's still a totally fine gamble because I think ultimately the way this Ravens offense wants to function is to get explosive plays in the run, especially until Rashad Bateman comes back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from a running back perspective, the bigger risk seemed to be with all the other random running backs the Ravens signed to their practice squad and elsewhere. So Trenton Cannon was actually active this game. I think he took 1 carry. We assume he may be more primary special teams guy going forward, given the other options they have. But you add Le'Veon Bell, Devontae Freeman, both former Pro Bowlers. I don't know what they have left in the tank about running back years. They're both like 80 years old. But, I mean, are either of them a threat to Williams? I mean, you would think Le'Veon Bell in particular is a player that in his prime was a really versatile player, contributing as a receiver as well as a rusher. Like, could he be coming in to take Williams' work here? Or, again, do you think that Williams looked really good? It was just like a matchup specific thing here.
So the one thing I would say about Bell is not that he's going to be a better runner at this point in his career than Williams, but I think if the Ravens really don't trust what they have going on in pass pro right now, and based on that Raiders game, they probably shouldn't. I think Bell is actually a better option for what they want to do because, Murray is already a really good pass blocker. That's part of why I think he was getting some play. And then Bell, that was kind of what he did in Pittsburgh for so long, is he was just a fantastic pass blocker and obviously a really good option in the receiving game. So it kind of just is going to matter on what the Ravens think is the solution to their problem. Like I said, I still think they're going to need to generate explosives in the run game. So Williams is going to get touches, but he may never really fully get into that where he's like their clear number one guy, just because it doesn't seem like he can fill some of the holes that those other guys can.
I mean, the pass protection thing you said, it scares me to hear that because I think
he gave up 1 sack to Williams did.
In overtime, the last play the Ravens had, I think, didn't Williams basically whiff on an attempted block that led to the sack that then gave the Raiders the ball back. I mean, it's one play, but Williams didn't seem to really know where the rush was coming from. That sort of thing makes me scary because it's a lot harder to evaluate that sort of thing with a running back when, again, Williams looked explosive. He was catching the ball fine. He looks like the type of player that just in terms of his touches would be efficient, but the Ravens may need more from their running back than Williams can give them on their own. And I think maybe that's what we think is capping him at, say, a mid-tier RB2 type of value. Whereas, I mean, once all of the primary Ravens running backs went down, you kind of had maybe this is going to be an RB1 in your mind, right?
Yeah, I think last night was kind of a good game for tempering the expectations on what we might get from him. I think we've both been saying he can still probably be a valuable player, and if you can get him at decent value, you should. But I think we're both saying probably not a guy we should expect to get 20 carries consistently and really carry the load of this offense.
Well, speaking of great pass protection, our third player, another running back, is Jamaal Williams, now of the Lions. I mean, I've seen all kinds of stats that suggest that he may be the best pass protecting running back in the league. And so I think that explains a lot of why new head coach Dan Campbell, who loves to bite kneecaps, maybe wanted Williams as part of his team, even though the second year DeAndre Swift is like the more explosive player, the more versatile player, that sort of thing. What really surprised me in this week's game, though, is that after the Lions fell behind, you figured they would be, passing all the time. Maybe Williams would be in to block exclusively, or maybe Swift would be the one running out and catching passes. He was healthy when people didn't expect it, but Williams got in there and had 8 catches for 56 yards on 9 targets, in addition to his 9 carries and 54 yards. And now I'm wondering whether he might be a flex-worthy player in his own right, even with Swift going nuts. I recommended a 31% FAB expenditure, Derek. What do you think here with Williams?
I mean, I think that's fair because I think he's going to continue to get playing time, basically for the reasons that you said. Like, he's a fantastic pass blocker, and that's going to always endear you to coaches, especially kind of with the way that Dan Campbell seems to want to be running that team. Yeah. And I think Williams is also just a better runner kind of between the tackles. He's a guy who's going to consistently grind out the 3, 4, 5 yard type of stuff, whereas, Swift is a little bit more dynamic in space. I think with the pass catching stuff, I'm not Jared Goff's biggest fan, but I'll credit to him. Like, he did a better job at just not completely panicking and getting to his running backs than I thought he might. And Williams isn't the most dynamic pass catcher, but he can at least kind of do the stuff underneath and, get you those 6 yards at a time where you can at least get to the next down. You can trust him to do that. And I think that with his pass blocking, with his adequate stuff, running between the tackles with inside stuff, I think he just brings such a higher floor to the position than Swift kind of does right now, especially with Swift battling some injury, that I think he's going to continue to get work, at least, for the next few weeks until I think they're really settled on Swift's health.
Well, researching the article, I was really surprised to find that Williams had a 10.5% target share last year with the Packers. That was 25th highest among running backs. And that's not about like him playing in every game. That's like a percentage of healthy games there. So like Williams was a lot more a part of the receiving game in Green Bay than I think many would have expected. Yesterday or Sunday, whenever it was, 15.8% target share was top 10 at the position. I don't know if that's going to continue. Swift did almost double his playing time, 68% versus 35% of offensive snaps, but it does seem like Williams is going to be like a dual type of contributor. He actually never had more than 9 targets in 4 years with the Packers, off to a really good start with the 9 targets this week. I think Williams is a flex option. I really do.
Yeah. And I don't know. I think with pass catchers at running back, sometimes we forget about the guys who don't do some of the sexy stuff. We have a guy on here later, I think Nyheim Hines, who I think is a fantastic football player, but we know him as a pass catcher because he'll do the stuff where he flexes out, into the slot or out, to the boundary and stuff like that. Or he'll run some cool routes, or, Kareem Hunt, for example, was doing the stuff, getting up the seam. Like, we remember running backs that do cool stuff in the running game like that. Jamaal Williams doesn't really do anything cool. He just does the consistent, safe stuff really, really well.
Dare I say the kneecap biting stuff he does?
Yeah, exactly.
Really well. Yeah. I just love Dan Campbell. I'm sorry. Like, I could go on a huge tangent about him, but that may not be the best use of our fantasy watchers' times. So I'll just keep the ball rolling here. Our fourth waiver player, another running back, definitely weighted early towards the running backs because a few of these guys kind of popped with roles we didn't expect. And because in a typical league, you just can't find these guys, which is why I have Mark Ingram of the Texans as a 25% FAB recommendation, even though he's part of what looks like potentially a 4-back running back committee here. Am I getting a little bit out of control? He did have 26 carries in week 1.
My concern with him is not so much the way that they're going to split up these carries on touches and stuff. I think it's just this offensive line is bad. He got a ton of carries, but I think he only got like 3.8 yards per attempt. And this is a not very good Jacksonville defensive line.
Shocking to hear that, honestly.
Yeah. Like Jihad Ward in particular, like they just beat the hell out of him and they were still only getting like, 3.5, 4, 5 yards a carry. So, I think Ingram at this point in his career is not a guy who's going to really generate explosives on his own. My worry would just be that when they run into some more competent defensive fronts, that they're really not going to be able to get very much going. And I think they're probably going to have to lean onto the pass a little bit more, which I think is not really going to be where Ingram is going to get his touches. And they really might start leaning on Lindsey a little bit more if they get into a panic, because obviously Lindsey is much more explosive runner, especially if you can get him outside. So I really think the volume is going to be there with Ingram. So if you want to bet on that, fine. But I would probably lean to the side of not being as excited to buy Ingram right now.
At first I thought this might have just been a 100% garbage time type of performance, but I actually looked and he had a higher percentage of the team's carries when the game was within 2 touchdowns than after that fact. So it really isn't that per se, but there is still a pretty significant split here. So as mentioned, 26 total carries, that was second most of the week, but the 63.4% carry share was just 11th highest at the position. And to give you some context of what that can mean from a fantasy perspective, I was just behind Leonard Fournette with 64.3%. So it's not that weird to see a player getting that kind of workload and not actually being that great of a fantasy player when he's not doing the other stuff, not catching the passes, not contributing in other ways. And Ingram had just 1 target versus 1 for Lindsey, 4 for David Johnson, and 2 for Rex Burkhead. So that's pretty split. He also only played 46% of the offensive snaps. So I don't think there's really any way he's going to be an RB2 in any type of PPR related format, but even in your standard formats, I'm just not sure it's going to all be there when the Texans aren't, dominating their future competition, which I dare say they probably won't be, right?
Exactly. It was cool that they got a win when, I think a lot of us wouldn't have been that shocked if they didn't get one for the entire year. But yeah, that Jaguars team looked really incompetent, especially on defense. It seemed like they were just a handful of concepts, especially in the passing game, that they looked like they'd never seen before as an NFL team. So, like you said, I think once they run into some more competent defenses, they might have to start leaning on some different things.
So what are your thoughts specifically on the 25% FAB recommendation here? Do you think that's too high for him? Would you honestly avoid everybody in this backfield? Because that's kind of what I'm feeling like with the Jets, who honestly, it may not be that different a situation. It's just that the Texans happen to play a worse team in week 1 and look good because of it.
I would probably lean on avoiding them. And the reason is it seems like, I was actually really impressed with what they did on offense overall. But what I would say is that they had a very clear idea of what they wanted with every single player, and they weren't going to try to box guys into stuff that they couldn't do. And I don't think that they were going to force extra touches just for the sake of getting a guy the ball. And so I think moving forward, Ingram's, volume is not really going to increase at all. And like I said, I really don't trust the offensive line at all to continue blocking any better. So,
yeah. All right, we're going to drop a little bit more significantly here in my FAB recommendations, but I actually think we're getting toward the more interesting players, the receivers and other players that I think there's more in line here with roles and skills that are interesting than just you need running backs so badly in fantasy. We're starting with Jakobi Meyers, wide receiver for the Patriots. I'm recommending a 13% FAB bid. I think there was a lot of fear over the summer after the Patriots added their 2 expensive tight ends. You get Jonnu Smith and Hunter Henry on over $50 million guaranteed dollars. They also play pretty significant money for Nelson Aguilar and Kendrick Bourne at wide receiver. And suddenly, it was totally unclear where Meyers stood in this pecking order. But week 1, pretty good, 6 catches, 44 yards on 9 targets. He led the team there by 2. And it just looks like the transition from Cam Newton to Mac Jones is going to lead to a lot more pass attempts and a lot more catchable targets for guys like Meyers. What do you think on that 13% recommendation?
I think 13% is fine because that's kind of saying if you can get him, cool. And if you can't, then whatever. I think the volume is probably going to stay consistent-ish. I think actually in that game, they might have thrown a little bit more than they're going to want to moving forward. They're probably going to want to run the ball a little bit more. But I think just as far as I think the way that this, the receiver core specifically is set up, Meyers is the guy to be their short to intermediate possession guy. I think Aguilar didn't maybe show it this week, but can be a little bit more of a burner and is maybe going to be the guy they're going to try to get down the field a little bit more. So I think Meyers does feel fill a very specific role for them at wide receiver. So, like I said, I think the 13% is probably about right. It's kind of the, if you can get him, cool. And if you can't, that's fine. Cause I think he's a good player, but the explosives probably just aren't going to be there. He's a solid yak guy for getting, the extra 2 or 3 yards or whatever, but I just don't think he's a guy who's ever going to break away from anybody. So that would kind of be my concern with him.
Well, see, it's interesting because I was working on a preseason article and it kind of came to light that Kendrick Bourne and Meyers have some overlapping tendencies and how they both might be good fits running from the slot, even if there may be some slightly different skill sets there. And so I was really happy for Meyers to see that he ran 99% of offensive snaps while Bourne was down at 44%. Aguilar was at 85%, by the way. As expected, it was frequent, two tight end personnel here, both Smith and Henry over 70%. But like Meyers was always on the field. And when he was always on the field last year, that led to a ton of targets. He became a starter in week 8. And from then to week 17, he had the third highest target share among all wide receivers in football at 30.1%. Devontae Adams was at 34.1, Stephon Diggs at 30.5. So like that's kind of the neighborhood of target share we're talking about, just maybe not that level of production because there may not be the touchdowns. Again, as you mentioned, even with Mac Jones, the Patriots may lean a little bit more heavily on the run, but like you're talking in a PPR league, this could be a really valuable player.
I think that's actually a great point. I think if you're playing PPR specifically, he's probably a lot more valuable for you, and you might want to tick up how much you're spending on him. But I would say in a normal league, I would be a little bit less excited just because, I think we both said the explosives he's not going to create them, and that's fine. He's a good player, but that's just not how he's, going to get his work.
Do we have time for a little Mac Jones interlude? I was just curious what your thoughts were on the rookie quarterback, maybe compared to what you thought of him pre-draft.
I thought he looked great. I think, the positives that we saw from him were there. I think he was incredibly accurate. He had a couple of touch passes that were just phenomenal. And he even had like a swing pass that he led, like you could not have hit a guy in stride any better than that. So I thought that stuff was beautiful. I thought he was really good at making decisions. He had the one like where he got frazzled on like a pressure and threw a screen back behind himself. And that play was pretty bad, but other than that, I thought he handled pressure really well and did really good job to, consistently make the right decisions, get the ball out where it needs to be on time, that sort of thing. And I think that's the player we all thought he was going to be. I didn't think he'd be that good at it week 1. Yeah. But that's kind of that. The only concern is obviously the arm strength. He had a couple of throws where it was like, if he could get a couple more miles an hour on it, it would have been complete. But I actually think it wasn't as hindering to his overall, game and efficiency as it could have been coming out of the draft. So I'm actually pretty excited with him from what I saw week 1.
And it sounds like good enough to enable players on the Patriots to excel in fantasy, even if he himself may not be a huge fantasy asset without much wheels. He can maybe prop some of these guys up, which is, I think fantasy players love to see that, have some options from the Patriots offense. Let me take a quick break to mention that, we are live at every day of the week during the season, 1 p.m. Eastern time on twitch.tv/FB Outsiders. Catch us there. And if you missed that, you can't make that. We're also on the Football Outsiders podcast network, and we're on YouTube after the fact as well. So you can find all of that at Football Outsiders. Also mention Football Outsiders Plus is a great tool. You can catch all of my weekly projections and other weekly Football Outsiders Plus projection tools. Where we do stuff with player research that lets you kind of dig into things and find some interesting splits that I think you'll find really interesting. So check that out. It's not very expensive. I think well worth your effort and time there. But popping back into some of the waiver additions this week, we're getting a little bit further down the line, but another running back here to mention, Nyheim Hines of the Colts. You kind of already pointed him out, Derrik, as a player that, we've kind of pigeonholed into a specific role. But I was kind of worried about Hines' value this season, even in PPR formats, because even though he's a very good receiver, and even though he got paid like a very good receiver just a week or two ago, Phillip Rivers, has sort of a rep as throwing tons of passes to his running backs, which I think last year it was 24.5%. I think that was it was like the 5th highest among 36 quarterbacks with 200 or more attempts. That was not Wentz's game until week 1 this year, but it was this week. Is that something we can expect to continue and something that would then prop up Hines from a fantasy perspective?
I love Hines on the football field. I wouldn't love him in my lineup. I think he really adds so much versatility to an offense, and you can get defenses to line up certain ways. But I kind of think the volume that he got this week was a little bit fool's gold. Okay. One, because like you mentioned, Wentz traditionally has not really been a guy who's going to, get to the checkdowns and target his running backs very often. And he did this week, but I think if we're trying to extrapolate based off of what the rest of his career has been, I think it's probably pretty tough to assume that he's going to, keep doing that. The Colts also didn't have T.Y. Hilton this week. Which I think, once he's back, they're going to want to just open the offense up a little bit more. So I think it's kind of a case where Hines just, got a little bit of a lucky performance from Wentz in the sense of where he was targeting. And also that's just kind of what the offense had to do with Hilton out of the lineup. So, I don't know. I think Hines is an awesome player, but I wouldn't be too excited about picking him up, I think.
Yeah. Thanks for S. Vanderpool on Twitch for throwing the kapow there. I really appreciate that. So Wentz this week, 37.1 or 37.5% running back target percentage, the highest among quarterbacks. Like, do you buy into any of this is kind of what needed to get fixed with him? Whereas like last year, he was trying to make the hero play every play and it just wasn't working. Like, is this something that Frank Reich could be orchestrating as a way to sort of revive Wentz's career?
I do think that's part of the fix. Would be to get him to just say like, hey man, you can trust the offense. Frank Reich is a really smart offensive mind. So I think that was part of the problem. Like you were mentioning in Philly, like Wentz just felt like he had to be the hero. He didn't trust the offense, didn't trust the offensive line. So I think if you can get him to dial back, I think 2018, he actually did really good job at that. This was after his, quote MVP year. Yeah. I thought in 2018, he actually did a little bit better job of just scaling himself back, being like, okay, I can trust the offense to take the check down. It obviously unraveled in the years after that, but I think getting Wentz kind of back to that would be ideal. And we saw it a little bit in week 1, but like I said, I think the overall track record for him in that regard is a little bit rough. And I think if the Colts start to lose a few more games and things don't really go their way for the next few weeks, which might be the case with some of the injuries they've had, I think we're going to see Wentz just start to revert because that's what quarterbacks do when they get into tough situations. They revert back to bad habits. That's just how it goes. Ben Solak of The Ringer mentions that all the time. Like guys play a certain way and they're going to revert back to it when they feel like they're in a pickle. So I think that would probably be my concern with Wentz. And Wentz with Hines. So, yeah.
And it was always a little counterintuitive to me. So, I mean, the Eagles had the number 1 pressure rate on offense in football last year, obviously with all the offensive line injuries they suffered. You would think that would be the time that a quarterback would check down to his running backs, 24/7. The Colts were like the number 2 or 3 offensive pressure team. So you would feel like if their offensive line kind of gets healthy and gets together, that may not help the running back target rates. But maybe more important than all of that too is like, Hines did well week 1, 9 carries, 6 catches on 8 targets. But Jonathan Taylor had 17 carries and 6 catches on 7 targets of his own. So it's like, is Hines getting enough percentage of the receiving work among his running backs even to make a difference? I mean, you may be right. I mean, that's why I was pitching the lower 11% FAB rate. Whereas in PPR, like maybe you can get 5 catches a week and maybe that's enough to kind of buoy you in your deeper formats. But this is still a Jonathan Taylor show. And if Wentz kind of moves back toward his traditional way of throwing downfield, throwing his wide receivers, there really may not be much here from a fantasy perspective, right?
I mean, I think the Taylor point is great because it's not like Hines is the only guy that they're getting receptions to out of the running back room. They clearly trust Taylor now to pick up some of that stuff. It might only be in the same way that, I mentioned with Jamaal Williams, where he's not doing anything flashy, but I think that that's totally fine, especially if Wentz, is maybe trusting him a little bit more. And I think, Reich is maybe trusting to keep him in those situations a little bit more. So I think, like you mentioned, just the fact that it seems like it's a little bit tighter in their, receiving race for the running backs, I think it's probably a little bit cause for concern for Hines as a fantasy producer as well.
Yeah. So next up, head into the New York Giants, where they brought in a lot of free agents this offseason, Kenny Golladay. They also added the rookie Kadarius Toney, who we've talked about and maybe been a little bit skeptical about before talking together on this show. But it was kind of business as usual in week 1 with Sterling Shepard. Led the team with 9 targets, had 7 catches, 113 yards, and a touchdown. Kadarius Toney had just 2 touches and -2 yards on the day. So, entering the year, it looks like more of a gadget player. Shepard also led all skill players with a 95% offensive snap share. So, I'm here saying that Shepard is kind of what he's always been. Whether or not that's valuable for you in fantasy may depend a little bit on your format, but he did average 13.5 PPR points per game last year, 34th at the position, which in a lot of leagues would make him a good flex option. That's why I recommended sort of a modest 6% FAB bid. What are your thoughts, Derrik? Do you think this is a 1-week sort of blip, or do you think Shepard is kind of what he has been despite the additions for the team?
I mean, I think I'd honestly probably go higher just because, they added Toney, but I really don't think he has it in year 1. I mean, the whole thing with him at Florida was he just didn't fully get what they were doing until it was Dan Mullen's 2nd or 3rd year there. And he finally kind of got it enough to where he could just be a really good gadget guy for them and play underneath. But I think in year 1 with Toney, you're just not going to get a guy who is a consistent route runner. You're going to have to do a lot of gadget plays. And I really just don't think, one, that Jason Garrett wants to be doing that, especially with the other receivers they have. That's a good three receiver core that they have that they can just turn to, that they don't really need Tony to be that right now. And I also just don't trust Jason Garrett to do that well. He's not Kyle Shanahan or whatever with Deebo Samuel. I just don't think he's going to do that very consistently. So I think Sterling Shepard is a guy who I think can probably still pretty consistently get targets in this offense, just because he's probably, I think, their smoothest route runner right now. He's probably their best short to intermediate guy. Kenny Golladay is obviously really good on the outside. Darius Slayton is really good getting deep. But I think that's kind of the beauty with this receiving core, actually, is that they all really complement each other well. And I think there's a very clear role that Sterling Shepard can fit and continue to fit moving forward.
That's kind of what worries me from a fantasy perspective, though, because I mean, you're kind of looking for the more, if not all around options, the guys that are the more primary options within their offense. And it seems to me like Shepard plays a role, but one with like a pretty limited ceiling. And part of that might have been just who the Giants were missing this week, like beyond even Tony and whether he can end up doing more down the line for the team. But like Evan Ingram was out this week, but I think there's some thoughts that he can be back for week 2 or maybe week 3. Without him, they had Kyle Rudolph playing 77% of snaps. They had Caden Smith playing 48% of snaps. I mean, those guys really aren't going to be a big part of the passing game, but Evan Ingram probably will. Plus Saquon Barkley, I think we all probably expected he might have a slower start to the season, but a really good receiving back despite his size. Like, will all of this just kind of chip away to the point where Shepard, maybe he gets, 6 catches a week, but it's going to be more like 45 yards, where it would have to be a deeper format for that really to make an impact for you in fantasy.
That's probably a good point, is that, this might be more if you're a little bit more of like, 12, 14 team league rather than like an 8 or a 10, something like that. I think that's a really good point, but I still think that the floor is just so high for him because of what he provides. Like I said, I think he's probably the guy who most consistently gets open in that offense. And so that would kind of be why I'm a little bit in on him. I also just think like the second year in an offense is going to help everyone. Maybe not the offensive line, but I think, the passing game, they might have a few more of these games where they really get guys clicking. I think, just like I said, with his consistently as he can get open, he has pretty good hands. I think he's going to be a guy who has a pretty high floor, and then you might get a couple of weeks like this, like he did against Denver. I mean, the one play where he broke Patrick Surtain off, broke him off on the crosser, caught it on the sideline, and then broke the tackle and took off. Like, he still has those plays in him, maybe not as much as we were hoping coming out of college, but I mean, I still think that you can get those weeks out of him.
So I think fantasy managers would have expected Shepard to be more consistent week to week than Darius Slayton. Again, like totally different styles of players. Slayton going downfield is going to kind of boom and bust the way that Marquez Valdez-Scantling traditionally has. But like, do you think Shepard actually might be more consistent and maybe more playable in fantasy than Kenny Golladay? Because that's a player the team spent a lot of money on and seems like would have a higher touchdown ceiling, but I don't know. He's been very inconsistent, obviously missed a lot of last year with hamstring issues and such. Like, what are your thoughts comparing those two receivers from a fantasy perspective?
I think Golladay is still going to be fine, and I'm not sure that Sterling Shepard is more viable than him, but I think I'm pretty comfortable saying that, Shepard over Slayton might be fine, just for the reason that, like, if this offensive line is either not improved, which it doesn't look to be, or is worse, I think they're going to have a harder time getting to what they want with Slayton down the field. And that might just naturally kind of open up these quicker, intermediate opportunities for Shepard. Whereas Golladay, I think, kind of fits a little bit into both for different reasons. So I think he'll probably still get his volume either way.
Okay, next up, we have the biggest fantasy beneficiary of what was maybe the strangest week 1 result. That is Jameis Winston, who threw 5 touchdowns at home / on the road in Jacksonville, whatever you want to call it, against the Packers, and just like a total dismantling here. The thing that made it so weird was that with those 5 touchdowns, he needed just 20 total pass attempts and 14 completions to do it. Only ended up with 148 passing yards. I didn't really know how to make sense of this. Plus, quarterbacks are always a little bit tough in fantasy to recommend FAB bids for, because in a lot of leagues, even a very good quarterback just isn't going to really push the needle for you in fantasy over the other waiver wire options. But I recommended a 6% bid. So maybe, Derrik, talk about that, but maybe more generally talk about what your thoughts are with Winston in this Saints offense. Like, is he going to be an effective player? Is he going to turn the ball over? Like, what are your thoughts?
I think it's legit, man. In our staff picks, we had to pick a player that we thought could outperform their Kubiak projections, and I picked Winston. I mean, I think he just getting another year in the Sean Payton offense, I think is going to do wonders for him. I think he was always kind of a better player than people gave him credit for. Obviously he was really volatile in terms of the turnovers, but I think if you can just get him to tone that down, just a little bit, which it seems like they did in this game, it's obviously not going to look like this moving forward. I think he only got maybe sacked once and obviously didn't throw any picks. Like, that's not going to happen every week. He's going to have these rough plays, but I think all the explosives are still going to be there. And I think what's so fascinating to me and why I'm still really encouraged on this is like, there really might only be 2 or 3 other offensive minds in the league that can consistently get guys open exactly where you want them to be, the way that Sean Payton can. I mean, that guy just really understands how to get every guy open just on any different concept. And I think Jameis Winston has always been a guy who, almost to a fault, really, really trusts what he sees pre-snap. And if he gets the one thing that he's going to, the one post-snap key that he thinks he has, he's just going to instantly trigger on it. And if you have an offensive mind who is consistently, having these guys open, I think Winston is really the perfect guy to, consistently take advantage of that. So like I said, it's probably going to be a little bit more volatile moving forward, but I think the Jameis Winston offense is absolutely legit. They might not have, I think especially once they maybe get Michael Thomas back, that could help. But I think, like I said, I think I really just trust Sean Payton especially, and Winston to be good enough for him to be at or better than what his FAB value is right now.
So the offensive mind angle I find really, really interesting, because while a lot of guys at Football Outsiders, Aaron Schatz included, have been banging the drums of, like he only threw 30 interceptions that one year. Like normally it was 16 to 20, which is a lot, but it's like not a team killing amount. But the thing that I don't think got talked about enough was the fact that was the Bruce Arians overlap year with Winston in Tampa Bay. And it just seemed like that he and Arians were just not a good fit in terms of offensive scheme in his efforts to push the ball down the field. Again, with what you're mentioning about Winston and his ability to sort of adapt to what he's seeing on his reads. That year in 2019 in Tampa, he had a 10.4 yard average depth of target. That was the second highest among all quarterbacks with 200 or more attempts. In week 1, it was 4.7 yards. Again, like you said, it's not going to be like that every week. A lot of that was circumstantial with the Packers giving them short fields and stuff. But like with Sean Payton, I think coaching him toward a more conservative offense, I think that can do wonders for his, his protecting of the football. Not only that too, I think the pass protection is a huge part of this too, because that 2019 Bucs team allowed pressure on 29% of dropbacks. The Saints last year were at 19.4%. I mean, it's almost half. So it's so much more favorable a situation for Winston to have success. Plus you have the flukiness of the interceptions anyway. I'm starting to think that this may be the case too, that he has the chance to be very good this season and actually like a worthwhile fantasy option.
Absolutely. And that Saints offensive line is good, man. So good.
And they mauled in week 1.
Yeah, they were just crushing people. Didn't really allow any pressures. I mean, they just looked fantastic. I think the point about the Arians offense is interesting and good because I love the Arians offense. I love what they do, but I think it's probably better for quarterbacks who aren't hyper aggressive and then maybe pushing them up a little bit more. Whereas Winston was already over the line and then Arians is just going to kind of keep you going. And I think that might've been a problem for them. And I think people also need to remember, before Arians, they had Dirk Cutter calling plays, and Dirk Cutter frankly sucks. Yeah. And they run kind of the Arians-ish aggressive style of play where they're going to do a lot of drop back that's really vertical and stuff like that. I think it was just a worse version of that. And so I think that again also kind of leaned into Winston being that way. So I think like you mentioned with Payton being able to dial back the offense and dial back Winston a little bit more on top of how efficient everything can be, especially with all their pass protection. I think this is really just such a good situation for Winston to cut down on the bad plays and still keep up all the explosive stuff.
I mean, Winston was already set up for public criticism by the fact that Tom Brady is just a lot better than him. So he was going to do better in any offense that he was going to do.
Right. How is he supposed to match?
But then it's worse because like you said, Winston was a terrible fit for Arians and Brady may be the perfect fit. Because again, it's a guy that maybe a little bit more naturally is conservative and is going to know better when to take those shots down the field. We saw it play out, but I think that Winston really can bounce back with, a coach that maybe better fits him from what they can do together. And I'm very excited. I mean, it may mean a little less in fantasy than some of these chalky running back guys, but that may be the kind of margin that you need to win your league. I think quarterbacks are very streamable in fantasy too. So in the right matchups, Winston is definitely going to be a good option for you in fantasy this year. All right, next up, we're going to pivot to a former Saint and now Los Angeles Charger tight end Jared Cook, who is 34 years old, by the way, 1 year younger than me here. But I'm still recommending as a 3% FAB expenditure, Derrik. Like, am I just, too much in the bank of a mid 30-year-old guy here? Or do you think Cook has a chance to actually do something this year?
I mean, I would probably lean to maybe just right for this. I really don't feel too strongly about this either way. I think what I would say on a positive side is that I think Cook does fill a very specific role for them. I think he's a really good horizontal field stretcher from the tight end position. That offense kind of lacks speed, especially with the way that they cut Tyron Johnson. They really can get value out of a guy who can stretch fields in particular matchups, against tight ends and safeties and stuff like that. So, and he did have a couple of targets on really important downs. I think they hit Cook on a corner route on a third and God knows how long. And then they targeted him, right after that, and Herbert threw a pick, but it's clear that he still has a role in this offense. My concern would just be that I think they still have a lot of other guys who are also just good. Yes. Even if he does fill a particular role. So I think he's going to be a guy who is probably really hit or miss in his production and maybe not a guy who is as high a floor. So it's kind of just if you're willing to take that gamble.
I mean, that's kind of the existence of tight ends in fantasy though, Derrik. So that's kind of the reason that this makes sense to me. Cause you're right. This isn't like a Tyreek Hill out there or a Travis Kelce out there. Even in week one, his 70% target share was 11th best at the position. Last year, he was 24th at the position with a 12.4% share. So that really may be more the range you're expecting to see with guys like Keenan Allen and Mike Williams being so good. Even Josh Palmer, the rookie, I think people are really excited about this season. So there are other guys in this
and they
offense.
Like to throw to their backs too. They just have so many other ways to spread the ball.
Yeah, I think Justin Herbert actually had a higher running back target rate last year than Phillip Rivers did. So
he was checking it down. He really was.
In my face as a guy always talking Rivers that way. But one of the things, I just think that offense is really good. I think Justin Herbert may be on the ascent. We mentioned a lot on this show and others that the year 2 quarterback jump is very real. That tends to be when you see the biggest improvements from a quarterback in his career. And so it just feels like there's a lot there where I think people thought he was leaving the Saints and that was kind of it. But this may be a more explosive offense and a better offense for him than what he had last season. And then the main point that I'll make here, and this is kind of hammered home by the fact that Antonio Gates used to be a Charger here, but the size doesn't really get old, he's always going to be a really good red zone threat. And we saw that last year, despite the limited targets. If you look on a per target basis, he had 8 expected touchdowns last year per 100 targets. That's just below the elite tier of guys. Gronk was at 10.8. Jimmy Graham was at 10.5, Robert Tonyan 9.0. So kind of just shy of that, to the point where I'm is 8 touchdowns out of the realm of possibility? I don't think so. So that's why I think that he has a chance to be a back end tight end 1 in fantasy. Not so much that he's going to have that type of target share, but the offense could be good and he could be scoring touchdowns because of it.
Yeah, my only reservation there would maybe be that, I think Joe Lombardi is good, but he is not quite Sean Payton. And so that would kind of be my concern with some of the red zone stuff. I think, Justin Herbert's also just a guy. I think particularly with Mike Williams there, they kind of already have a guy who is also really good at red zone stuff. So that would kind of be my, conundrum with that.
Not when Herbert throws 55 touchdowns this year, but
yeah, that's true. I guess if he throws enough of them, it doesn't really matter.
All right, let's keep talking tight ends, but let's circle back to the Saints. I would have had these in order, but I'm trying to do these in terms of my recommended FAB expenditures. And I have actually Adam Troutman as a 2% FAB recommendation, not Juwan Johnson, the tight end that scored 2 touchdowns for the Saints last week. And I've gone back and forth on this. I kind of started thinking that Johnson was going to be a recommendation. I'd actually heard a lot in the offseason that Johnson, the converted wide receiver, was taking more of the Jared Cook role with the offense. And so I was like, that's a little bit intriguing. But then the more I actually looked at the stats for this week, the more I decided that Troutman was probably the player to recommend. He had 6 targets. Johnson only had 3. He played 82% of offensive snaps. Johnson played just 19%. So pretty huge disparity there. Derrik, can you maybe help me figure out what the way to go is with the Saints tight ends?
I really like Adam Troutman, but I think it's kind of in a situation where, kind of what I had with Ingram and the Texans is that I think the Saints do such a good job of understanding exactly what each player is good at and why and how they should be used. And I don't think they're going to force Troutman, I don't think they're going to design a whole lot of targets for Troutman, especially like down the field. I think he's very much a guy who is like a valuable blocker. He's a guy who they're going to have in for a lot of their, if they just have one tight end to block, it's going to be him. If they have two, he's going to be one of them. And I think a lot of his targets are going to be more a lot in the underneath area. I think you saw a lot of, where he was just sitting over the ball, where he was check releasing, Winston hit him on one of those. So I think that's really all you're ever going to get from him as a receiver. I don't really think he's going to be explosive. Whereas I think their other tight ends, obviously Juwan Johnson is probably, to me, I think going to be a little bit more explosive, going to maybe be a little bit more guy that they want to target in the red zone. I think we saw that just this past week. The problem is just like you mentioned with Johnson, I think that's still a tough bet too, just because overall he's not going to get the volume of snaps. He's going to be a guy who they've used very, very situationally. And I think betting on a guy who is that situational is probably rough. Like I said, I like Troutman. I think he's, a true Y tight end in the NFL, and I think they use him well, but not in a way that is very good for your fantasy lineup.
Yeah, fair. So like Michael Thomas is out, but he'll be back eventually, and he'll probably be a fantasy option when he is.
That's a good point too.
Alvin Kamara, obviously a tremendous fantasy option. Is there anybody else in this offense that we should be looking at, if not the tight ends? Like, I guess Marquez Callaway popped in the preseason, had those 2 touchdowns. And I think the third preseason game when Winston won the job, but like, is he going to be a big part of this offense? Like even he in week 1 didn't do much, but again, this was such a weird lopsided victory that I don't know what conclusions you can really safely draw here.
The argument for Callaway would definitely just be like in future weeks, they're probably going to have to target down the field a little bit more, and Callaway is going to be better for that. Obviously this week they just ran the ball a ton and were able to kill the Packers, 6 yards at a time. But to me, I think if there were another guy I would maybe be interested in this offense, it would be Tony Jones Jr., the backup running back.
Okay.
Just because I think they want to be an offense that runs a lot and then sets up Winston to do, a lot of the stuff off of play action and stuff like that. But even then, I probably wouldn't be too excited because we all know Kamara is going to get a bulk of the carries unless, he gets hurt or something.
That's good intel for me, though, because like Jones was somebody that I thought about maybe including as one of the last guys in my waiver column. I ended up not doing it, but I'll definitely keep an eye on him going forward. Okay, we got a couple more guys to hit in the episode, but I'll mention again, every day of the week, Monday through Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern time on twitch.tv/FB Outsiders. You'll either have me, sometimes with Derek, sometimes with another guest. You'll have Aaron or Mike or somebody doing a Football Outsiders related show on twitch.tv/FB Outsiders. Check that out. Check us out after the fact on YouTube and the Football Outsiders podcast network. Derek, let's close this out with a couple more guys. Circling back to the Patriots wide receiver groups, I threw Nelson Aguilar in here as a 1% fab option. As mentioned, Meyers played more, 99% versus 85% of the offensive snaps. But you kind of brought up Aguilar having a little bit of a weird role in week 1. I actually looked at that as an encouraging sign that 4 of his 8 targets were behind the line of scrimmage. Last year, he had just 3 targets behind the line of scrimmage. And I think that led to more of the like boom or bust nature, where even though he ended up scoring a pretty good number, maybe like 8 touchdowns last season, he was hard to pull the trigger on in fantasy because you didn't trust that the floor was high enough. But with a different type of role in this offense, could the floor be high enough to maybe make him a worthwhile fantasy option?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually a lot higher on him as a fantasy option than Meyers. I think they both serve very distinct roles, but I think kind of like you mentioned, with the Raiders last year, he really, made his money by being a deep threat, by being a guy who kind of stretched the field. And Mac Jones is maybe not the best guy to take advantage of that. But I think in future weeks, as this offense develops, as they really start to get comfortable, they're going to want to try to open things up a little bit more. And I think Aguilar is by far the best guy that they have that is suited for that. So if we can assume that he's going to be the guy that is going to get a lot of those deeper targets, and he is still probably a guy who they want to feature a little bit in the short to intermediate area. I think he ran a couple of really good routes and still looked like a guy who could get consistently open in those areas. I think he has a pretty good chance to be, maybe their leading receiver. Okay. I think he's just, probably the guy who is best suited to do a little bit of everything for them. And like I've said before, I still think overall the offense needs some speed, but for now, he is the best guy that they have as a speed threat. And I think that's going to matter as we move forward. Okay. So it sounds like you actually think he's a better fantasy option than even Jakobi Meyers, right? Yeah, I would think so. I think Meyers might have a little bit higher of a floor, especially if you're in a PPR format, just because, Mac Jones is a guy who likes to play it a little bit safer sometimes. And like I said, Meyers is a great possession guy, but I think if you're looking to get a guy who can maybe give you a little bit higher of a ceiling and especially have some, a couple of pop-off weeks, I think Aguilar is probably the guy I'd be looking at.
That actually does make a lot of sense. So he did have 7 targets, just 2 behind Meyers for the week, but then obviously then popped 5 catches, 72 yards and the touchdown. So like I was already expecting Aguilar to have more touchdowns than Meyers this season, but guy, I mean, I feel like Mac Jones being good, like really opens a lot of options here. So maybe some good steals from both of these guys for you for your fantasy waiver wire.
I think Mac Jones being, looking good is huge too, especially because I think probably maybe Aguilar's best play was like they hit him on like a seam route down, I think the left hash. Mac Jones maybe threw it a touch late, but it still got there. And the fact that Mac Jones could show that he could make some of those tough throws over the middle, on those vertical routes, I think bodes really well for Aguilar moving forward if they can get a little bit better at that sort of stuff.
All right. We opened the episode talking about the Kyle Shanahan related confusion. We needed to close it talking about Kyle Shanahan's related confusion. I'm recommending Trent Sherfield, the wide receiver, formerly of the Cardinals, for a 1% FAB bid. So like not a huge expenditure here, but like maybe more surprising to me than the fact that Trey Sermon didn't suit up week 1 was that Kyle Shanahan kind of like, didn't really rely on Brandon Ayuk very much. Ayuk played just 47% of offensive snaps versus 49% for Sherfield. Sherfield was the starter. It didn't really turn into a lot of like actual fantasy production, but another weird game where they were up huge early over the Lions and they were just kind of running all over them. But Sherfield did end up with 3 targets, 2 for 23 and a touchdown. Ayuk did not have any targets. Shanahan after the game said that Sherfield earned his role with the team. Ayuk, there's some questions about his professionalism or whatever that other stuff would be, but like, what do you make of this whole situation? And does it such that actually would make Sherfield intriguing for you in fantasy?
I mean, 1% FAB is such like a who cares that I wouldn't blame anybody for going for it. But I'm not too excited about him. Okay. I think at some point Ayuk is probably going to start getting a few more targets, even if I'm not actually very high on him as a player. And I think like the Sherfield touchdown, like, you saw it, it was kind of like, I could be mistaken, but I think it was when they had Trey Lance in and he ran basically just like you come in, you whip back out. He was so open. I think literally anybody on that offense could have ran that route. So I'm not too excited about what he really provides for this offense. I know he can be a little bit of a deep threat. He showed that in the preseason, showed that I think with the Cardinals a few years back, but I'm just, I think with Samuel looking as good as he did, Kittle obviously being George Kittle, and then probably wanting to lean on the running backs as much as they can. I just don't really see how the ceiling ever really gets there for Sherfield.
I mean, I guess the logic would be that Shanahan just does so much with scheme that it can kind of turn any player that is in a favorable role in the offense into an effective fantasy player. That probably means more from a running back than it does a wide receiver, right? But like, I don't know, like if you aren't high on Ayuk and Sherfield then could be potentially like a starter for the team, would the fantasy value not be there just based on the role?
I mean, it might be, but I also think in future weeks, Sherfield would be their guy that they want to use down the field. But the thing is, like, that offense doesn't really target down the field very much, even if they're going to use a guy who's going to stretch it so they can open up stuff underneath. And I think Jimmy G is just not a good deep passer either. So I think even if he might get some opportunities in that way, I just think that this is like a particularly not very good, quarterback coach situation for him to make good on that.
Yeah. And one other reason to maybe not panic on Ayuk was the fact that he had injured his hamstring later in the preseason. And then I think it had only been about a week since that recovery had happened. So I'm wondering if maybe that had played a role too. It can be really hard to sort of parse what Shanahan says and kind of make sense of what that could mean for fantasy perspective. But, it intrigued me enough that I thought Sherfield was worth mentioning from a waiver wire perspective. But like, I think like you, I agree that he's after all of these other potential options, like both Patriots guys. I had Mike Williams higher on the list and stuff too. So like there are other wide receivers to go at here, but in your deeper formats, maybe Sherfield worth mentioning. Derrik, before I let you go, we have a Twitch question from Marls Chartel. Is that a Charles Martel joke from The Replacements? I hope so. He asks, did anyone mention anything about Christian Kirk? So Kirk wasn't a player that I listed as a waiver wire option for week 2. To me, like he played less of a role. I think he scored maybe twice, but he played less of a role in the offense with Rondale Moore being in the mix now. AJ Green out-snapped him and I think out-targeted him too. But did you like what you saw from Kirk? Obviously, the Cardinals looked really, really good in beating the Titans. So maybe there are multiple receivers here that could be worthwhile for you in fantasy.
I mean, I'll be completely honest. I haven't seen every single game yet, and that's one of the last ones that I have yet to get to, and I didn't catch very much of it on Sunday. What I will say is that I think simply getting Larry Fitzgerald out of the lineup is not only good for Kirk, but is good for the offense as a whole, because he was just, I mean, he was dragging ass, man. Like Larry Fitzgerald was on his last leg.
Let's be careful what we say about mid-30s guys right now, Derek. Just look who your co-host is. We've mentioned this already.
Hey, I don't think anyone in their mid-30s watching or hosting is worried about their athleticism to make their job work. So I think we're okay there. But I think, Larry Fitzgerald was just kind of holding back the speed of that offense. And so when you add Rondale Moore, you get Kirk a little bit more touches, get him in the slot. I think it just opens up everything. And I think if Murray's going to look as good as it seemed like he did that day, then Kirk is probably going to get more touches and more opportunities. Not even really because he's any better of a player than he has been. I think it's just this, things have kind of worked themselves out for this offense and for him.
Okay, perfect. Derek, it was great having you. It's going to be great having you every Tuesday to help with these waiver wire opinions, giving your scouting perspective to help out the math nerd and me. You have a ton going on this year, not just at Football Outsiders. So why don't you let everybody know what all you have going on and where they can find it?
Yeah, so I will still be doing, obviously, this show now every week, and then I'll have the film room at Football Outsiders. But I'm also doing, I'm doing for Bleacher Report, I'm doing their year-long, NFL draft stuff. I'm doing all their front seven, so edge, defensive line, linebackers. That's going to be all me this year. We have a great group of guys working on all the other stuff, so keep up with that. We'll have obviously a lot more content after, there's more than 2 weeks of college games to watch.
Sure,
and then over at Odds Checker, I'm also doing some gambling stuff, lines, spreads, props, pretty much everything you can think of.
Outstanding. Also follow Derek on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter, Scott_Spratt. And then if you're watching live on twitch.tv/FB Outsiders, thanks. And circle back tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern time. I believe Aaron Schatz is doing a mailbag type of episode. Maybe wrong, but hit him with a ton of questions anyway. I'm sure he would love to read them and talk about them on the show. Look for that, and then circle back to us on Friday when we'll do our start and sit show for week 2. Very exciting to have football back. Thanks again, Derek, and thanks for all of our listeners.